Twilight Masquerade is almost upon us, so we are here with a tier list from yours truly, Rahul Reddy, seven-time world's competitor, and I'm just kind of good at the game sometimes. So I have actually not played with any of these cards, these new cards, and I've probably read very few of them as well. So I'm going to give you guys my expert opinion on some of these decks and where I think they're going to rank, given that I've played no games with them. So hopefully you guys enjoyed this content. It's a little bit of fun for me, a little bit of fun for you, lighthearted. These are my opinion. So don't take it seriously, and I'm pretty sure I'm gonna be wrong. So just tell me to eat my words later in the chat. Um, we're gonna start off with Arbok EX here, an unfair stamp. I feel like that's probably a tier 3 deck if you can actually pull all the pieces off. You do have Dark Patch, so it doesn't seem impossible to actually make work. Dialga probably goes into tier 2. I do feel like Dialga probably still has some legs to stand on with Metal Maker. I think you're still a pretty good deck. You can put a lot of pressure on a Dragapult, probably one of the few decks that can still do quite a number on it. However, I do think decks like Miraidon are going to be able to pressure you pretty hard in this new format. I do think Charizard kind of being phased out a little bit and Pal being phased out a little bit means you lose two of your better matchups. And then smaller things like Lost Box can maybe just gut you from the setup. I never thought Dialga was the most consistent of decks. So maybe if you're just getting your board pepper sprayed by this Dragapult and then Devoed, maybe you just lose the game because of that. Like maybe you just can't like hold your own, because I think Beldums are 50 HP if I'm not mistaken, and I don't think there's a 70 HP Beldum. So if you don't have a 70 HP Beldum and you don't actually set up, your board's just gonna get gutted. I think Blissey goes into tier 3 because I think even though Blissey is really cool and it's like one of those archetypes where if you actually get the ball rolling and everything rolling, you can do a ton of damage movement with Monkey Dories, like maybe almost 90 damage each turn with the movement of the abilities, with the Blissey and the attack, and then you have two Blisseys set up back to back so you can chain them over and over again. Cards like Hero Cape giving you more versatility, but the damage just isn't there a lot of the time with a deck like Blissey, and I think you're really good into something like Dragapult, but any deck in the format that can one-shot you just makes it so your deck is not real. And I think there's enough decks in the format that can actually one-shot Blissey early or like put pressure on Chanseys that the deck might not be able to stand up on its own two legs. And if you, I guess the problem is you get one Blissey set up, and once one Blissey is set up, you have to make sure there's a second Blissey being able to get set up, and you don't have reliable draw outside of like a couple of supporters, and you're playing like a healthy amount of recovery supporters like Turos, Sharons, whatever. And then if you're playing those supporters, you're not playing supporters like Iono and Research, and you have to find bosses. So like it's one of those things where it's like you're playing it kind of like an Arceus shell and just kind of hoping the pieces will fall into your hand. I don't really know what's going on here. Just don't do that. I mean, like Ursaluna is a good card. Fortress is not. That should stay in the binder probably. So just don't play it, I guess. Arctina, I think tier 3 for sure. I think Arctina, Path Judge, I think is like kind of outlived its lifetime, even though Path doesn't even exist anymore. I think that Dragapult being able to hit for 200 and put 60 is like pretty insanely good numbers for Dragapult. I think Zard is still a terrible matchup for you. I think Miraidon is a pretty awful matchup, and I think Lugia is like genuinely terrible. And I think some of these decks are going to be up there in the tier 1, tier S category. And if you can't even touch those decks, I just don't understand how your deck can be considered a real deck, in my opinion. Arc Vulpix actually is going to go into the don't play this category, because even though Vulpix was there in this current format where you could have pulled off some matchups into things specifically like Zard, you don't have that anymore. Dragapult doesn't have an ability. Greninja EX doesn't have an ability. Like there's going to be cards that have less abilities in the next format that are really good, and so you just don't get to do as much as you would like to, and I think that's just the nature of things. Arc Armor probably tier 3. I haven't actually played this deck at all, but I do believe that like the fire cards are pretty good, so I think maybe you can like kind of lean into the fact that you have good fire attackers, and kind of play like more like a firebox or maybe like a control archetype where you play like Mist Energies and like Hero's Cape, and maybe just like play Grabbers and Aries and stuff like that to kind of just like disrupt your opponents a little bit more. And maybe that has a little bit more merit than playing it like a straight attacking build. But if it's a straight attacking build with fire stuff, I don't think it actually can hold its own into a lot of the format. Bibzard, I think, is tier 2. At the very least, and the same with Pidgeot Zard, and I think my logic for that is still that Zard is still Zard. If you get the ball rolling and set up against a lot of decks, your deck is still very good. Zard can still set up and attack pretty efficiently into a lot of things. You have an incredibly good attacker with an incredibly good engine already behind it. You now get the addition of Unfair Stamp to disrupt cards early, and you can even play like a slower control archetype with a LAKEY like I've been playing with Airy and a couple other pieces. And you can still play Charizard like Charizard is meant to be played. However, you do have more bad matchups than good now in the format. And that is something that Charizard does not like. Decks that play Devo, decks that can kind of spread damage. Um, and if that happens, you don't have the best time. So you kind of fall away from the tier S that it used to be sitting in. But I think tier 2 is still not a bad place to be, right? Like, look at the decks below it. Like, you don't want to be Ursaluna Fortress over here. This deck, like, I would hate to be this guy. I think Diplin Thwacky deck goes into tier 3. I think as much fun as it sounds like and as much fun as it looks like, I just don't think it's got legs to stand on to be a tier 1 deck, especially with Dragapult being in the format that can just take 2 knockouts pretty much every turn on your board. And then you're basically just like tickling it a little bit. You're like, tickle, 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 tickle. Like, let me do 130 plus 130 damage. Tickle, 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 tickle. Like, if you can't even one-shot a Dragapult with your super awesome saucy attack, like, I don't even know, man. Like, it's kind of a doomed cause. But I do think this deck is really funny, and in a metagame where, like, Dragapult doesn't exist too much, maybe you take it to a locals and have some fun with it. But I do think you absolutely gobsmack Zard, and I think, like, stuff like Dialga and like, maybe Tina and stuff should be favorable. But, again, Gatekeeper deck. Speaking of Gatekeeper deck, Dragapult goes into S tier for sure. Phantom Strike, I think it is just absolutely insane to attack. Like, it's just absolutely insane. Yeah, the energy typing is a little bit weird. And no weakness, 320 HP, stage 2, with an incredibly good stage 1 to back it up, where you can just use it to set up while you're setting up your board. 200 to the active and 60 to the bench. Just puts so much pressure and helps a ton of numbers for a lot of decks. I just don't understand how, like, a lot of decks can hold up to this. Reliably is probably the best way to put it. Like, I just don't understand how a lot of decks can actually deal with this reliably while, you know, their board is getting gutted. They have to actually deal with this, and, like, nothing can really one shot this besides maybe POW in the format. So it's just it's a lot harder for decks to actually set up. And I think decks will play more Mist Energies, which in turn also, like, Lugia is popular. So in turn, Enhanced Hammers will make a comeback. Frostless, I think, don't play tier. I don't really know how the deck is supposed to work. I'm not really the biggest fan of it, but I do think that it is a victim of just, I don't know what it does. So Greninja goes into tier 3. I was really hyped for this card, but I do think that obviously into a metagame where people are going to be playing heavier Devo and stuff of that nature, you just can't really play a stage 2 that isn't as impactful as something like Charizard or Dragapult. I think Greninja is very impactful as a 1 energy attacker for 170, and you get to keep your setup going. But if your board is going to get gutted pretty aggressively, I don't really know how you can evolve up slowly. Like, Charizard can kind of do it because they have really good Charmeleons that don't get affected by stuff like Draga, and then Greninja doesn't have that. I think Treads is like a sleeper tier 2 pick, or sorry, Iron Thorns, because, like, Iron Thorns you can just play, like, quad Thorns with, like, a path, like a pseudo path deck, and, like, put a lot of pressure on some of these decks that need to use their abilities. Because every deck, I think, in this format has to use, like, a Rotom or a Pidgeot or some way to set up, like, a Luminion. And if you just go 4 Thorns and, like, play, like, Crushing Hammers and, like, cards that disrupt your opponents, like, maybe this is enough to win games. Like, maybe you just play, like, 4 Thorns, 4 an Airy, like, stuff like that. Like, I don't know. But I actually am, like, captivated by the idea of, like, being able to just cheese your opponents with Iron Thorns. Like, I feel like there's got to be something there that, like, I'm missing, other people are missing, but it seems really good. I think Lost Box decks still fall into tier 1, just because the nature of tier 1 is that it is a deck that can compete with the entire field and doesn't take terrible matchups across the board. I think Dragapult is obviously a terrible matchup for it in nature, but I think you can play, you still have, like, Moon, you still have some of these attackers that can put a ton of pressure on Dragapult. And if Dragapult doesn't, like, really, you know, have a great board or get their Manaphy down early or get their Jirachi down early, you can kind of gut their board and, like, play a little bit more turbo, or maybe, like, go for an early hands. And then if, like, Dragapult doesn't kill hands, maybe you prime catcher the turn after, and you get, like, 4 prizes with 1 hands potentially, and then all you have to do is figure out a way to kill the Dragapult, which easier said than done, obviously, but, you know, it is the merit there. I think Tina also goes into tier 1 because Tina has Star Requiem, which is another way for us to kill Dragapult. And with Max Belt, if you choose to play that, you can one-shot the Dragapult as well. I think Unfair Stamp is obviously just significantly better in a deck like that. But if you can go Unfair Stamp 280 the Dragapult and then clean it up later with Sableye, I think it's very strong as well. So just attackers that can do a lot of pressure, I think, to something like Dragapult and Zard is really good. And I think Giratina also has Giratina and Lost Box both gain Blood Moon Ursaluna, which is a really good late game attacker to clean up a lot of stuff. Like, being able to go, like, 80 on something with Sableye or cram something, going into, like, a 2 prize turn or, like, your last prize turn to set it up to be killed with Blood Moon Ursaluna, like, plus boss or something, is just an incredibly good resource because now you have a way to rad Zard without needing an energy. Which is really, really good for the end game, especially for Lost Box that needs multiple pieces to operate sometimes. You just need a 1-piece card, like a 1 card plus, or maybe like a 2 card combo as opposed to a 3 card combo or a 4 card combo now. And Blood Moon Ursula just, I think, benefits both these decks greatly. I'm just putting Gudra in don't play this category because I just don't understand where like any of its good matchups are anymore. So I just wouldn't play a deck like this. I just don't think it's worth putting my time and resources into. I just don't understand why this is better than the other Lost Box decks, and that's my thought on that. Same with Zorak. I think Zorak, it's cute and it's funny, but I just don't understand where it's going to have more merit than demerit across the grand scheme of things. Yeah, I think Luxray EX is probably a tier 3 deck if you can actually make it work, because as a stage 2 deck, you need to actually set this guy up, attack with it, do a ton of damage, rip resources out of your opponent's hands. But then when you do all that, like, where do you go from there? What's the next step is the big question. So it's like, are you doing something that wins you the game from that position, or are you just going to keel over and die? And that's, I think, the big question with something like Luxray and how you're going to build it. And again, with stage 2s going to the format, like Dragapult, like Charizard, they can put a ton of pressure on. You're taking prizes. You're not like a slow control deck that just sits there and does nothing. When you're doing something, you're giving your opponent opportunities to take more damage, like with Charizard. So Devo hurts this deck quite a bit. Again, same problem as Greninja, I think, a little bit. And again, this also needs 2 energy technically, but you do have double turbo. So if you're playing it with like a Pidgeot line, same with Greninja, like you have to set up 2 stage 2s, and you don't have the luxury of using something like Xatu that Dragapult can. I think Pidgeot control goes into tier 1 just because this deck is absolutely nuts and bonkers, and you get the Whistle that looks at the top 5 and benches a Pokemon, and now you also get the Fan that moves energy. So you have these 2 additional tools that are just really, really like annoying for your opponent to play around. And so like some point you're like, but I can't play around everything in Pidgeot control. I have to like take a loss somewhere. I think players will be more likely to take a loss into Pidgeot control than other stuff. Like even Dragapult's gonna have trouble into it because if you go Fan, like Luxray maybe, and like just give up 2 prizes there, you get to Fan and energy off the Dragapult, and then it's very difficult for them to play the game in that position, or like Fan your Snorlax or something, or even Fan Mimikyu, because if you Fan Mimikyu, Dragapult can't go through Mimikyu, and now like the like little guy who hits it like Dracloak or something, you get to move energy for free to like their Rotom, and all of a sudden this energy is now stuck, and some of these decks don't play a ton of energy, so you can just stick those energies on the board and win through that alternate win condition now. I think Ogerpon goes into tier 3 as well. I think the deck is really cool for what it's worth. I think it accelerates to the board really, really well, but I just don't think the deck is like viable in a grand scheme. I think Espathra goes into tier 2 still. I think you do lose a big matchup in Charizard and Pal, probably like losing some popularity. And Dragapult probably kind of guts you a little bit because your Flittles are so small. But I do think like if Charizard and like Lost Box and some of these other decks that don't necessarily have like the greatest time into Espathra continue to be good, Espathra can still seal wins and like work off the back of that. But I do think that it is like still a gimmick of a deck. I think Gardevoir goes into the bottom of tier 1. I think it's like deep bottom of tier 1, like barely, because I think Gardevoir has all these new resources, especially Monkey Dory. And the fact that Monkey Dory is absolutely broken gives you the ability to play less tools, so your deck gets less clunky. And now you get that Ace Spec that lets you get 3 dudes. And that Ace Spec I think is absolutely broken. And then from there, it's like Gardevoir can kind of have a semblance of being Gardevoir, old Gardevoir again. But again, the big problem is you don't have big attackers to close out games, which is my biggest gripe with the deck. Like, you don't have a great one-shot potential onto, like, Dragapult to end the game like Zacian V. You can't just, like, go bench Zacian V end game. So that's something I think Meowscarada is tier 3 now, just because even though it was maybe potentially playable a little bit, it just drops to the bottom of the barrel because you just lose the fact that Charizard becomes a worse deck. I think Pal goes to the bottom of tier 2 because Pal goes from having a bunch of really good matchups to going into a position where now, like, you're just under duress. Like, your Bidooфs are under duress. Your Frigibax is under duress, and if you have to play the 70 HP ones, your deck is just so much worse because you can't retreat these guys. Like, it just feels so much worse than it was before. And if you do damage on the board that doesn't kill Monkey Dory's in the format, Blissey's in the format, like, there are these things that are just really annoying to deal with now, so I just don't think it goes there. Palafin, I think, is tier 3. I think Palafin is a funny deck, and I think it'd be really good. But there's, like, so many rules behind using the 0 to hero ability that, like, I just didn't think would work that way, that is making me, like, kind of turned off the card and the idea. Because, like, I don't know, I feel like there's a lot of potential for it, and then they were just like, hey, you can't do all this. And I'm like, cool, sick, thanks. Moon, I think, is a tier 2 deck, because I think Rory Moon is still super aggressive and can put a ton of pressure on all these decks. And I think the name of the game is to be aggressive at an IC like this, or in the format, because I think some of these decks are slower. Some of these decks cannot react to the pure aggression being put on by Moon. But if any of these 5 decks in tier S and 1 setup, Moon cannot compete. And that's, like, my logic behind it. Like, Moon just does not get to compete with these decks if they get set up. And that's why Moon falls to where it does in tier 2. As simple as that. Goldango tier 2. I think Goldango is still a really cool deck. I think obviously the problem is still like it is a 2-prize deck across the board, so you can't really finagle anything funny. You just have to play your 2-prize deck and hope that everything works out in your favor. And if it doesn't, it doesn't, and that's just really unfortunate for you. But I think it's got a lot of potential because you draw a million cards, and it is one of the few decks that can one-shot Dragapult. So you have that going for you as well. But I think your like Lost Box matchup, Tina matchup, Guardian matchup, even probably a Pidgeot matchup are all probably terrible, just because you have 260 HP. Like you're so fragile to take down in those scenarios. Lax probably goes into tier 1 as well because I think Lax gets all those control cards as well. I think maybe you have worse matchups in some of the tier S and 1 decks, but you get all the same pieces. You have the same ability to play the fan into like Dragapult that other decks do. You can just be big and beefy. You'd be really annoying now with those like new cards, the whistle and the fan. I think Lugia. Oh, I grabbed the wrong deck. I think Lugia goes into tier S because even though it's like really inconsistent still and really clunky, you do get the access of either Legacy Energy or that new Fortnite loot box chest, and both those cards are like pretty insane. I think for the deck, Fortnite loot box chest gives you more consistency. Legacy Energy lets you play fun stuff like Radzard and Hands now, and Luminion gets to be an attacker again, so you can wipe your board of Luminions in an efficient manner. And playing Hands lets you cheat the game a little bit more because now Hands and Shinshino are in your deck, and these guys are both just really, really good attackers to close out the game. It's one of the few decks that's pretty resilient into Dragapult. But again, the problem with Lugia is like, can I play the game? And that is like the number one question that needs to be answered. I think the Dawn goes into tier 1 because I think the Dawn is still super inconsistent. I'm not very sold ever on the Dawn. But I do think the Dawn is really, really good with being aggressive in this format because Zard is one of its worst matchups, and Zard is kind of taking a backseat in this format right now. Hypothetically, so if Zard kind of takes a backseat, you can kind of come out and just be really aggressive as Dawn and hope that like everything draws in your favor and works in your favor, and you can just outrun your opponents in matchups. Banette Guardy is probably tier 3. I just don't understand why this deck is better than regular Guardy. I think Banette is fine, and maybe you can cheese some more people by locking them, but I don't know if like that lock does enough against something like Lugia that could just attach a couple times and start attacking, or Dawn that can just attach a couple times and start attacking. Like maybe you get like Comfy decks and Giratina decks a little bit, maybe Dragapult decks, but Dragapult decks should be playing like a thick enough Dracloak line, like maybe like a 4-3-4 line that they can just evolve up anyway, and by like turn 3 they're just gutting your board with Phantom Dive. I just wouldn't play Gouging Fire. I just don't understand why this deck is good. I also wouldn't play this version of Future Box. I think that Hands is way better than Reboot Pod plus Friends. It's just way more consistent. And Reboot Pod plus Friends gets way worse because Zard is worse in the format, so Leaves gets worse. And there's nothing that one-shots Dragapult in the deck. So now you don't even have that option. I think that Hands is still tier 2. I think you have one less bad matchup in Zard, obviously, but Zard is still around to some degree. Tina is still not the greatest matchup. I think Gardevoir is not the greatest matchup either. You have to set up and kind of try to roll them. There's 2 control archetypes that get significantly better that can now look at your top 5 and try to find those crowns, try to find those Miraidons, try to stick stuff in the active you don't want there. But Lugia being a good matchup for you is really, really good. And I think you can try to steamroll Dragapult early enough because if you can Miraidon first before they can even set up, like maybe their board is just Dracloaks and you can start putting a lot of pressure on. Great Tusk Mill is probably tier 2. I think this deck is got a ton of potential. I do like the idea behind it and like what it can potentially do. I just don't think it's very reliable. I think Ancient Box also falls into tier 3. I just don't see a world where like this deck is going to be able to deal with like 200 plus 60 because 200 is such a perfect number. Miraidon seems like a pretty awful matchup too because you need to ramp numbers pretty early. Gardevoir seems fine. Lax is fine. Pidgeot control's terrible. Tina and Lost Box seem fine. But like your just numbers aren't good enough for a lot of matchups anymore. And Legacy Energy and Lugia is really, really annoying too. I think Raging Bolt is also tier 3, unfortunately. So there's a lot of tier 3 decks on here. But yeah, I don't really think the deck is very good, particularly compared to the tier S decks and tier 1 decks. So that's my early tier list. Hope you guys enjoyed. Just my opinion. Let me know in the comments what you're most excited for. And I'll catch you guys in the Twilight Masquerade format. Peace.